Okay, everybody's got to put their seatbelts on because I'm doing the history of spinal cord stimulation in 10 minutes. Yeah, right. Okay, no, actually that's the assignment, but the yeah, right was that it won't be complete history, but we're going to do our best here. Beginning with the first slide. Okay. Objectives: provide a history of the SCS and trends in advancement. So the first two slides are they cover a lot of the same information. It's really, the purpose of these two slides is to give you a concept of how old this technology is. This is so often when we meet with patients, they think you're talking with them about the new fandangled thing, and they're like, oh, has this been around for a while, doctor? It's like, yeah, for like 80 years, right? Or 60 years. This is very, very old technology. First device was tested in humans in 1967. First implantation was in 1981, and then we had FDA approval shortly thereafter. And what I'm going to do is kind of walk through, I think a lot of us don't appreciate, why would we, kind of the different waves of advancement that have occurred in this technology. So I'm just going to kind of give an overview of what that looked like. But I wasn't there in 1967. I want to be clear. So the first leads that were designed were a single lead placed into the epidural space percutaneously and left there. They were placed for refractory pain for patients that were terminal. Those were the first leads. So soon thereafter, I think it was in the 1980s, just prior to the FDA approval in 1983, was when we started really having a concept of how we could use the spinal cord stimulation technology for chronic pain and in a more realistic way. The first thing that occurred after it was available on the market and efficacy was evident. The first kind of wave of innovation that occurred was all around the design of the electrode. So first a paddle was created. Then there was expansion from 1 to 4 to 6, 1 to 4 to 8 to 16 contacts, which we have in some products now. Additionally, it went from monopolar to bipolar. So in its initial, we think of this as being bipolar we take for granted now, but it hadn't been the case with our first leads. The multi-electrode array using 2 electrodes in the array is a new tech. It was a new advance also. So there were leads that had 2 arrays within 1 lead. There were paddles. Of course, we're familiar having 4. And there was also this new concept of tripole guarding using paddles. So using the cathodes and anodes in positions to push the charges deeper or laterally as the patient requires. Contact spacing is something you hear about now as well. This has become kind of a way that the stimulator companies are marketing themselves, is by talking about tight space leads or wide space leads, or how many contacts, or tight space contacts or wide spaced, and then how many of those contacts there are. And multiple independent current control. Is this a term anybody's heard yet? This is another feature of kind of the wave of advance that occurred first, where there were just changes to the leads themselves. So multi-independent current control means that each individual contact that's in a lead has an individual wire that is associated with a programmable output, which is controlled by the generator, which is compared to bipolar electrode pairs, in which case they really are only turned on and off. You can't increase or decrease the amplitude of individual leads independent of one another. Okay, so first wave we saw in SCS was all around just how fancy can we make this electrode? What form, what shape? So the next 2 waves that occurred were in 2004, our first rechargeable IPG. huge. That changed everything, right? The ability to recharge an IPG. Now, there's a lot of talk now in our industry about that definitely revolutionized things. We started thinking about this a lot differently. We've made assumptions about a rechargeable IPG being better, and made assumptions about that this is what patients are going to want, is to be that engaged with their therapy. And that kind of is actually a conversation, if you attend some of our medical society meetings, you'll see is resurfacing. Is like, well, why did we make that assumption that having a battery that a patient had to interact with and be considering and be aware of it was the introduction of charge burden. So advances in MRI conditionality came thereafter, and that became kind of a marketing issue, right? Whoever could kind of grab onto that title the fastest, they all had the capability of doing that. It's something that's achievable for all companies, but they have to kind of decide how they're going to invest their dollars. And so some companies place this at a higher position in their hierarchy of investments than others. And at this time, really all of the devices are MRI compatible, or conditional, I should say, because they still have limits to the number of Tesla that the MRI machine can be. The next wave came in programming, and I think that's probably what many of you are, this is the world you're living in now, is the confusion of what all these various programs mean. And similarly, the companies that are marketing their different products, they create programs, waveforms with their technology using what's unique about their particular lead design and trying to kind of make a name for themselves with one sort of waveform and owning it. So I think it was Medtronic was one of the first that kind of had a concept of making the MRI stimulation amplitude have some sort of a feedback mechanism. It was an accelerometer so that according to the patient's position, we know that the epidural space changes in its volume according to the position that we are in, whether we're laying, standing, whatever. And so we can make, therefore, assumptions about whether that epidural space may be becoming smaller or larger. And an accelerometer, just like a level that you have in your garage, in your epidural lead, will then give us, it'll inform to how much amplitude that patient may need based on our understanding of the size of the epidural space. High frequency was another term, right, that we all know very well, associate this with HF10, high frequency 10. High frequency was actually this concept of subparesthesia sensation, or subparesthesia frequencies was in the literature long before HF10 came out. But that was the first time that it was really actionable and absolutely caught fire and completely changed the landscape of neuromodulation by really embracing the concept of not being dependent on paresthesia for patients to receive pain relief. Burst is an Abbott term, Abbott DR, which is Dirk Riddler. But he's an Australian neurosurgeon who's been incredibly prolific in publishing on concepts of burst, which is an interesting theory. It's about burst is the concept is to deliver a sequence of action potentials that resembles your own neurologic function at baseline. And those literature articles are very interesting in what they describe the differences in the way that electrodiagnostic testing and interoperatively does or does not recognize different types of programs. And the punchline in there is that burst is the one neuromodulation waveform that is reliably identified by electrodiagnostic intraoperative monitoring. DTM is Medtronic. This is a technology it was a waveform that was designed around the concept of targeting glial cells. glial cells, I mentioned earlier in our dorsal root ganglion discussion, glial cells are they are absolutely ever present and prolific in the nervous system. The ratio of glial cells in the spinal cord is like 20 times the ratio of neurons. They're everywhere. They're in the dorsal root there as well, in the substance of the spinal cord. And they can be activated in environments of neuroinflammation. And so, for those of us that do more comprehensive pain medicine, we use medicines like low-dose naloxone with the concept of suppressing or responding to a suspect of glial cell activation, contributing to central sensitization. And DTM is targeting that specific. The concept is that they're able to target, their waveform is able to target that specific physiologic reaction to chronic pain impulses into the spinal cord. Closed loop. Closed loop is, I would say, probably the newest waveform that has caught some attention in our specialty. And closed loop is about identifying a biomarker that is meaningful to adjust the stimulation to the nervous system. The biomarker for closed loop stimulation is these evoked potentials. And what that means is that anytime a impulse is sent to the nervous system, the action potential that is produced in the nervous system can be measured. And evoked potentials is a summation of those that then is measured at the electrode. And so the evoked potential is really a measurement of how many neurons, what volume of nervous system tissue has undergone an action potential as a result of the stimulation that's applied to it by the electrode. And so that's the biomarker. The biomarker is activation of a volume, a quantity of nerves. And then in response to that biomarker, the amplitude of that stimulation is adjusted so that it is providing a very steady delivery of energy to the nervous system. So the outcome of that biomarker is really being able to deliver an incredibly accurate and constant neural dose of stimulation to the nervous system. So FAST is Boston Scientific waveform. FAST is fast-acting subthreshold programming. It's a little different. It is subthreshold, meaning subparesthesia, or below the frequency that paresthesia would be sensed. However, it is actually stimulating the dorsal column, not the dorsal horn, and it is paresthesia mapped. So these are different concepts. The reason it's paresthesia mapped is because FAST programming wants to know where that center point of stimulation is so that it avoids it. The concept with this particular therapy is that if you target specifically the center point of stimulation where patients' sort of paresthesia mapping would be most poignant, then you run a risk of causing irritation of the nervous system tissues. So it actually intentionally identifies that in order to avoid it and instead stimulate the area of neural tissue surrounding that central point of stimulation. And then there are other components to that proprietary algorithm of waveform that then does stimulate the center point, but with a plan to be stimulating the inhibitory interneurons. So that's quite different. There's a lot of, when you are a consumer or consume on behalf of your patients, you'll talk to many different reps who say, I can do that, and I can do that, and I can do that too. And there may be some truth. It won't be exact, right? But there may be some truth to it. It's really a matter of the way that manufacturers want to invest and then market their materials, right? But certainly not every manufacturer can do it exactly as the studies for the alternate has produced. So are we nearly ready in the OR?
Lab. You guys ready in the lab?
Till I get the thumbs up, I'll just go through some landmark studies representing some of those waveforms. So HF10, high frequency 10, is what we know as Nevro. This is the Senza RTC, which compared 10 kilohertz frequency with wide-spaced dual percutaneous leads that are positioned not in parallel, but just purposely out of parallel, overlapping the T9, T10 disk space. And what's different about HF10 beyond the really large energy usage that comes with this is that there's a wash-in period. It takes, we know, several days for patients to get any pain relief from this. There's absolutely no mapping at all, which was very attractive to physicians when this first came out. The concept of having equal or superior pain relief and not having to spend the time paresthesia mapping in the OR is a pretty attractive idea for a busy practitioner. This was actually kind of the first time this term neural dose came out, though, because HF10 requires recharging the battery. It requires a rechargeable battery, and it requires that battery be recharged in most circumstances at least every couple of days. Most often less than that. So this concept of neural dose and the tax that it is to our patients to be so engaged with their therapy was sort of came to the forefront of the stage with this advent. Are we ready back there? Just tell me when. 4 minutes. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So burst DR. Similarly, these patients, they were implanted with spinal cord stimulator leads in the posterior epidural space, and then they were randomized to either receive conventional posterior, paresthesia column stimulation, or this specifically subparesthesia burst programming. I mentioned earlier that Abbott's burst and DRG studies are among the first that started to move the conversation in spinal cord stimulation away from only ODI, oswestry disability, and NRS, but started to look at other functional measures that were more representative of a person's emotional position. And what's really unique about burst is that they have demonstrated that their program stimulates elements of the medial column, not only the lateral column, which in the medial column, as we know, communicates with the thalamus and is responsible for a lot of the emotional component of pain. And if you look at deeper into this world of programming, of waveforms, you'll see that there are studies that compare burst DR programming, fMRIs, to an fMRI of somebody that has undergone ECT or is on SSRIs, and the same areas are activated. So it's very interesting that some spinal cord stimulation in particular programs could have what appear to be clear emotional impacts, and that's been demonstrated by their studies recording of pain catastrophizing index and global impression of change, PHQ-9 and GAD-7. DTM, I kind of went into this a little bit already, but the idea here is that it is said to alter gene expression within glial cells, which are a majority substance of the spinal cord. Closed loop as well, I kind of already talked about the evoked multi-compound action potentials. And I would say the conversation around DTM also very, very intriguing to think about having not a unidirectional conversation with the spinal cord, but having there be feedback and adjustment. I mean, we aim in all other parts of our practice to personalize our care plans. And so it is exciting, the concept of being able to have some unidirectional information just leaves the question open, is this yet the biomarker that's most meaningful? So I'm going to close down and let you watch a spinal cord stimulator trial and implant.
Okay, we ready in the lab?